Severus Snape may be the single worst character HBO could have chosen to race swap in the Harry Potter reboot. Not because race swapping is inherently bad, but because Snape violates almost every rule that makes a race swap actually work. And once you understand those rules, you realize something interesting. Harry Potter actually has several characters who would have been excellent choices. Hello there, and welcome to today's video. With the HBO reboot of the Harry Potter saga filming and coming soon to an HBO streaming service near you, all sorts of information about this new series has been filtering down to the masses. And one of the details that has become quite the flashpoint for fan discussion and discourse has been the casting of Paapa Essiedu as Severus Snape. Now, before I go any further, I would like to make it very clear that this video is in no way meant to serve as a verdict for Paapa Essiedu's acting ability. Nor am I interested in using this video to grandstand to you all about where you should stand politically. I think there's enough videos like that out there. Instead, this video is going to be examining why the choice doesn't make sense from a writing perspective, and how the writing may have to be warped to accommodate the new casting. So let's begin. Now, when you change the race of a pre-established character, 5 things really matter. And those 5 things can, in turn, be transformed into a bit of a checklist for whether or not a specific character should be race-swapped. Rule number 1. Race must not already perform symbolic work in the story. A good race swap for this first checkpoint would be a character whose identity is defined by choices, beliefs, or roles, rather than a character with marginalization or privilege already coded into their character DNA. To put this into practical terms, a character like T'Challa, the Black Panther from Marvel Comics or the MCU, should always be black. This is because one of the very themes of this character is that he is the ruler of an African nation that was never colonized. His stories often grapple with complex and rich themes of colonization, the responsibility of power through the context of African diaspora, and whether his nation, or more importantly he as a black man, should be doing more to help those he sees as his people. His stories often position him as a symbol of black pride, black power, and of resilience. Changing his race would have massive ramifications for just about every aspect of his stories and his struggles as a character. Rule 2. The swap should add thematic weight, not overwrite it. Now, a successful swap would deepen an existing theme and reinforce what the character already represents. A failed swap would instead introduce a new symbolic axis that competes with the original story, and in doing so, force the narrative to answer questions it was never really designed to ask. An example of this would be Professor X from Marvel's X-Men. See, Xavier represents moral restraint and faith in institutions, while Magneto represents kind of retaliation against oppression. Their dynamic works because the audience can weigh 2 competing philosophies. But if Professor X were race-swapped into a group with a long history of subjugation, the thematic balance changes. The question stops being, is restraint morally right, and becomes, who can afford restraint? In other words, the swap doesn't deepen the story's theme, it replaces it, breaking the philosophical symmetry between Xavier and Magneto. Rule 3. The character's moral trajectory should not become encoded with harmful stereotypes if the character is race-swapped. Now, this can be a tricky rule to fully understand, but I think a really good example for a character who would absolutely fail this rule exists in Star Wars. See, imagine race-swapping a character like Anakin Skywalker. His story is about emotional instability, violent outbursts, and ultimately becoming one of the most infamous villains in fiction. Even if the swap was well-intentioned, that kind of moral trajectory risks unintentionally attaching negative stereotypes to the character's identity, which is ultimately exactly what this rule is meant to avoid. Rule 4. The swap should not require systemic rewrites to avoid problems. If you have to change multiple other characters' races, or rewrite institutions, or reframe entire social dynamics, then the swap becomes invasive and shouldn't be done. Now, a pretty solid example of this would be Katniss Everdeen from The Hunger Games. Now, her character is tied very closely to the social structure of District 12, an impoverished coal mining community inspired by Appalachian culture. If you race-swapped Katniss into a historically marginalized group, the story would suddenly raise questions about racial hierarchy within Panem. Avoiding those implications would require redesigning the demographics and politics of the entire world. Rule 5. The audience must still be able to read the character clearly. Now, this rule is quite simply pragmatic. If the swap forces the audience to constantly interpret race instead of character, and turns every action into a socio-political Rorschach test, then the character stops functioning as a narrative tool. Consider Sherlock Holmes. Holmes works because he functions as an almost pure instrument of logic. Emotionally distant, socially abrasive, and obsessively analytical. But if Holmes were race-swapped into a historically marginalized group, those same traits might start to be interpreted as alienation or social exclusion rather than eccentric brilliance. The audience stops simply reading Holmes the detective and begins reading Holmes through a racial lens, which makes the character's narrative function less clear. Now, all of these individual examples to the rules that I've given you fail, one particular rule. But that doesn't necessarily preclude them from being race-swapped. It's simply used as an illustration for the rule in question, and demonstrates the difficulty each character would face if the decision was made to race-swap them. But, with that in mind, I called Snape the worst possible choice for this kind of swap. So, let's now put him through these 5 rules to see just how accurate that statement is. Now that, we have a framework for evaluating race swaps in storytelling, we can test it against the casting choice that sparked this discussion in the first place, Severus Snape. And once we apply these 5 rules, it becomes very clear why Snape was probably the worst possible character HBO could have chosen. So, the very first rule we established when race swapping a character relies on us asking the question of whether or not Snape's race performs any symbolic function in the story. And the honest answer is no, it really doesn't. His character is defined by his guilt, his obsession, his bitterness, his moral compromise, and his supposed love for Lily. None of these motivations are tied to racial identity in the text, and so he actually clears this first checkpoint quite well. In fact, it's interesting to note that there are very few characters in Harry Potter who would have difficulty passing this point. Which, at least to me, would seem to indicate that race swapping in this particular story should be pretty easy. But hold your horses, because there's still 4 more rules to check, and unfortunately, that's when the cracks start to show in this casting choice. Now, the next rule focused on thematic overwrites. So we have to ask if the new casting deepens Snape's themes or overwrites them. Now, we've already established that Snape's themes and motivations are guilt, obsession, bitterness, moral ambiguity, and in a big picture sense, redemption. And when you swap his race, the focus does indeed stop being on these core motivations and themes, instead becoming about racial discrimination, systemic bias, and social marginalization. The key question at the heart of this character shifts from, can a bitter man still do the right thing, to, is Snape being treated unfairly because of his race? And this can be seen in practical examples like the Golden Trio always suspecting Snape of wrongdoing, without any definitive proof, or the way Dumbledore treats Snape during Snape's, indentured servitude, which could honestly be a whole video on its own. So Snape absolutely fails Rule 2. But importantly, even if a character fails this rule, a story could still work. It wouldn't be ideal, but it could be serviceable. Which brings us to Rule 3. Rule 3, the core question that needs to be addressed, is whether the character's moral arc risks encoding harmful stereotypes if there's a change. So, Snape's arc includes him joining the Death Eaters, his obsession with Lily, his abusive relationship with his students, and just his general bitterness and resentment. If these traits become attached to a historically marginalized race, then they can end up unintentionally echoing negative stereotypes about instability, jealousy, and aggression. Even if unintended, the optics immediately become complicated. A character like Snape, whose defining traits include bitterness, obsession, and moral failure, is an extremely risky candidate for a race swap. But it's at Rule 4 where Snape truly falls apart. Rule 4 asks if the swap forces the story to rewrite the surrounding characters, social dynamics, or plot points. And Snape fails this hard. Snape and the Marauders attended Hogwarts during the 70s, where the Marauders constantly bullied Snape during their school years. And this is quite important because the 70s was a hotbed of racial tension in the United States and throughout the world. But in the United States specifically, it was an incredibly important decade for the civil rights movement. The fight for equality marks the 1970s as an incredibly transitional period for America and the world. In America, the abolishment of Jim Crow legislation had led to a tumultuous period as people of color fought for their rights to be seen as truly equal, and where racism was further weaponized to try and prevent this in a large swath of America. Now you might be asking, why am I using America specifically instead of, South Africa or more to the point, England, where the story is set? But that's because a large portion of the audience who will be watching the HBO series is going to be American. And whether you like it or not, our media is framed through the lens of an American viewpoint. So with all that in mind, this is not a good backdrop to have for a character who was hung beneath a tree during that time, for obvious reasons. But more than that, this casting and this time period now forces us to view the Marauders through a very different lens. In the scene where James levitates Snape by his ankle under said tree, Lily asks why he bullies Snape so much, and his response, he responds with,
"Leave him alone," Lily repeated. She was looking at James with every sign of great dislike. "What's he done to you?" "Well," said James, appearing to deliberate the point, "it's more the fact that he exists, if you know what I mean."
Now, in the books and the movies, where the racial overtones weren't present, this was a really bad indictment of James's character. One that has continued to influence the fandom into thinking that he's a bad person to this day. So now, with Paapa Essiedu's casting, this line gets thrust right into the forefront of modern socio-political tension, as the audience is going to have to grapple with the question, was James Potter bullying Severus Snape because James Potter was a racist? It would require massive rewrites to Snape and the Marauders' history to make it be seen otherwise. Then, there's the whole unrequited love and being a Death Eater, which only serves to further push racial stereotypes and stigmatizations. Ultimately, it proves that race-swapping Snape is not a self-contained change, and has massive ramifications for the story as a whole. Which brings us to Rule 5. Rule 5 asks, can the audience still read Snape clearly? Snape originally functions as a narrative misdirect. He's a morally grey character who is a constant red herring villain. And as such, readers are constantly forced to ask the question, is Snape good or evil? But the swap introduces another interpretive layer. That being, is Snape being unfairly suspected because of prejudice? Now the audience isn't just analysing Snape's actions, they're analysing the social meaning behind those actions. And that just weakens the mystery surrounding the character. When you apply these 5 rules, the problem becomes very obvious. Snape doesn't just fail one of them, he fails almost all of them. And he's not the only one. Ron is a character defined by economic inequality and jealousy. Race-swapping him would lead to these core themes embodying racial stereotypes, and his character journey and large family would then be seen through the lens of social prejudice. Likewise, Sirius Black would be a poor choice, as his character's themes are wrongful conviction, anger, and recklessness. When you race-swap Sirius into a historically marginalized group, then these characteristics take on a racial discrimination edge, as his story would instead become about social commentary on the justice system. Then Harry himself would actually also be one of the worst swaps possible. His treatment at the hands of the Dursleys would take on a racial edge, and if you were to race-swap the Dursleys to try and correct that, then the dynamic with the Dursleys has the potential to embody racial stereotypes of non-Western households. His mistreatment at the Dursleys would become a poor reflection on marginalized upbringing, and the stereotypes that would accompany that new lens. Which, raises the obvious question. If the goal was to introduce more diversity into the story, were there better characters HBO could have chosen? And the answer is yes. I can think of 3 characters that would have been infinitely better choices to race swap in the new reboot if the production wanted to diversify the cast without impacting the writing. And the first is Lupin. Lupin's story is already about stigma, fear, and internalized shame. He represents the good man broken by a society that fears it. He's defined as a character by love, restraint, and moral clarity. Adding a racial lens via his casting could deepen the metaphor of inherited stigma, while adding texture to his self-loathing and withdrawal. It could offer an interesting opportunity to strengthen the tragedy of a man who knows he's good, yet believes he has to stay small. But that doesn't mean he's a perfect choice. See, you would run the risk of stacking metaphors, as lycanthropy was already used as a stand-in for HIV, which, runs the risk of turning Lupin into a symbol rather than a person. And the consequence is that it could unintentionally frame his good nature as exceptional rather than normal. Now, Lupin can work, but only if the adaptation treats him with the same quiet dignity from the books, rather than explanatory emphasis. He would have to remain a man first and a metaphor second. Now, a much better choice would be our second option, Albus Dumbledore. See, Dumbledore's race is largely irrelevant to his narrative function. His authority comes from wisdom, not lineage. His moral ambiguity is philosophical, not instinctual, and his arc is about power, restraint, and regret. Crucially, he's not coded as impulsive, violent, or jealous, and his failures are strategic, not necessarily emotional. Now, this avoids criminalization stereotypes, instability tropes, and moral suspicion being racialized. And yes, I hear you. You're currently thinking to yourself, didn't Dumbledore treat Harry poorly, raising him like a pig for slaughter? Wouldn't that give him the same morally grey qualities as a character like Snape? And yes, Dumbledore is somewhat morally grey in how he chooses to fight for good, but that moral uncertainty is purely intellectual, it's not social. His actions are judged by history and the fans of the series, not the characters or society in the present. Dumbledore is honestly one of the cleanest race swap candidates in the series. However, I believe that the best race swap is one that's already been done. And that's the character of Hermione. She's a character who is already representative of social prejudice in the story, and so changing her race to one that is historically marginalized in the real world only deepens her thematic relevance, without needing to directly address the historical marginalization in the story itself. Similar to Lupin, it can be used more metaphorically. It would be a little more overt in the series, but that's not a narrative-destroying change like Snape is. Now here's the thing. Diversity in adaptation isn't inherently a problem. But like every storytelling decision, it has to respect the structure of the story itself. And once you apply even a basic writing framework, it becomes clear that Snape wasn't just a questionable choice. He was probably the worst possible one. But hey, I suppose we'll just have to see how, the series chooses to tackle this. But, for now, that's all I got for you guys. Thank you for watching. Let me know what you think. What do you think of Paapa Essiedu's casting? What do you think of my suggestions here, or the lens and the rules I came up with? What are your thoughts on the Harry Potter series at all? Let me know in the comments down below. Thank you.